Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, Episode 101. Today, the Amateur Traveler goes to the French Riviera and to Monaco.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no. 15-hour flight, oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I have 4 news stories for you today. The first one comes from Europe a la carte blog. Is flying more stressful than knife point mugging? It says, I was shocked to read that the flying appears to be more stressful than being subject to knife point mugging. 4 volunteers making a return trip from London Heathrow to Amsterdam were kitted out with chest monitors to detect change in heart rate, arm pressure pads to measure change in blood pressure, and fingertip sensors to measure change in physiological stress. The experience of making this return trip led to heart rates of 4 times normal resting levels and psychological levels of stress equivalent to a free fall parachute jumper. Wow. I've been through Heathrow recently, and I'd say it's a little more stressful than average, but I would find that level of stress a little surprising. If you're looking to raise your heart rate while you fly, though, you might be interested in a story that I saw on concierge.com. A word of warning, if you're heading to Ecuador in the next few weeks, your flight within the country might look like a Victoria's Secret catalog come to life. That's because domestic carrier Icaro Airlines is hosting lingerie fashion shows on several of its most popular routes, according to Reuters report. Also, a stressful travel story. If you happen to be going to Saudi Arabia, you should be aware that Saudi Arabia government continues to bar Jews and Christians from bringing such items as Bibles, crucifixes, and Star of David into the country, and is threatening to confiscate them on site, according to an article that I saw in TravelIndustryDeals.com. And then if all of that isn't nearly enough stress for you, you can sign up for a trip for $100 million through Space Adventures, headquartered in Vienna, Virginia, to get in line for a trip to the moon as a tourist. Check out links to all of those stories in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Or those of you who are listening to the show on iTunes can always use the iTunes enhanced version of the show and can click directly on a link for any particular picture or article that's being discussed on the show. For those of you who listen to the show on a regular basis, you know that last week I started what I expect to be a 3-episode story about our most recent trip to Europe, and I'm using that particular trip to illustrate several different things that I've learned about traveling to Europe. This particular episode is going to focus on the time we spent in France, and I won't repeat everything I said in last week's episode, but this particular trip we went to Germany and Switzerland, which I covered last week, France and Monaco, which I will cover this week, and then also to Italy, which I will cover next week. And last week I covered more details about our flight plans, doing an open-jawed trip, doing trip preparation, and so I won't cover that material again today. I will say, for those of you who don't want to go back and listen to last week's show, that this is a trip with my wife and I, my wife Joan, our daughter Liz, her friend Donna, and then friends of ours Susan and Kevin. So there were 6 of us. And one of the first questions that came up as we're doing trip planning, which I did not mention last week, was how we were going to get around. And when you're traveling with 6 people versus 1 or 2, you have some different options in terms of getting around more economically. So, for instance, a rental car is a better option for 6 in terms of just cost of getting around, at least for the kind of trip we are doing, where we're traveling to a number of places, than it would be, for instance, for 1 person. Of course, the disadvantage is we needed to get something that would hold 6 people, and that cost more money. And then we were going to do an open-jawed trip, and so we needed to pay a drop-off fee for the car, which cost more money. And having driven in Europe previously, I wanted to get the smallest possible car that would hold us and our gear. Because I was once in a large van with my boss at the startup company I worked for at the time in Bremen, Germany, when he tried to take one of the very tight corners in a very small parking garage in a VW Westfalia and tore out the side of the van. As if that weren't bad enough, I was the one who was left with the car and had to turn it in. Of course, despite the fact that I had a year of German in high school oh so long ago, the best I could come up with if I was going to have to explain in Germany what happened was "Mein Auto ist kaputt," which wasn't going to be very descriptive. So we opted for going with the rental car rather than the air passes, or with the other option that you should consider these days, which is flying point to point on the small airlines. But since we were not doing the major cities, but rather more out in the country, a lot of the stops, it seemed that that wouldn't be as good an option for this trip. And so we live with the fact that in Europe it is more difficult to maneuver and park the cars in the city than it would be, for instance, in the United States. And so often, like on this leg of the trip where we went to Nice, we just drove to Nice, got very, very turned around and lost, and then found a place to park and parked the car and left it there for a few days, which is not necessarily then going to be the most economical option, but we did enjoy the freedom and the flexibility in getting from point to point. In terms of driving in Europe, and I've done a whole show on international driving, there's really not that much different in terms of driving the autobahns, the autostrada, the different highway systems there. It's really, I don't think it's better driving this necessarily, at least than the major freeways we have out here in California where I grew up, but it is fine driving, the only difference being that the faster cars and the slower cars, there's probably a greater difference in the speed, so you spend a lot of time passing and such, but it's not difficult driving, and the more difficult driving gets to be when you're trying to negotiate the very small streets of the older towns, and that's one of the reasons why a smaller vehicle is what I prefer, the smallest possible vehicle that will hold everybody. And I'll include a link in the show notes to both Rick Steves' guide to driving in Europe as well as his guide to Eurail passes for 2007, which has a great planning map in terms of comparing the different costs between the two. And in terms of driving in Europe, we did look at both AutoEurope.com and EuropeByCar.com, and both of those seem to have better rates than the larger big-name companies like Avis, Hertz, and Budget. And we did end up with AutoEurope.com because they matched a price we got from EuropeByCar.com, except that their van had air conditioning, and given the weather that we ran into, that was very good that we had gotten the air conditioning. As with most cars in Europe, it was a standard, even though it was a minivan, because the automatics are more rare there, and it was also a diesel. But a good car. We had a Ford minivan that we were driving, and I don't remember the particular make of it. But enough about that. Let's talk about the French Riviera. As we were driving from Switzerland into France, and we're driving through Italy by Torino and Genova to get there, I'm reminded of an old joke, and it's a stereotypical joke about Europeans, but I'm going to use it to illustrate a point. The old joke is that in heaven, the British are the police, the chefs are the Italians, the mechanics are the Germans, the French are the lovers, and the Swiss are the bankers. While in hell, the Germans are the police, the British are the chefs, the French are the mechanics, the Swiss are the lovers, and the Italians are the bankers. And I've always liked the joke, but I've liked it because I think it's a great illustration of an attitude that you need to have when you go to Europe. It's amazing to me that I can wake up in Switzerland and drive through Italy and end up in France. It's not all that long a drive, 6-7 hour drive, and yet things can change. So we went to sleep one night in Zurich, and despite the fact that 2 million people were there partying, by the time we woke up sometime between 5 a.m. and 10 a.m., it was clean. In fact, it was cleaner than Nice, where we're going in France, on a good day. So things are more organized in general and run more smoothly in Germany and Switzerland, but on the other hand, so I love them. I love them for that, and I also found that my wife, who is very organized and who is very much a task-oriented person, when she got to Zurich and she's looking around Zurich, she's saying, I could get an apartment here. These are my people. And we did enjoy it, and we enjoyed the food, and we enjoyed I'm having a bratwurst with my sauerkraut in Germany, and I'm having fondue in Switzerland, and yet I also very much enjoy France and Italy, but differently. And I think part of the way you need to enjoy Europe is to appreciate what is good and wonderful about the particular country you're in, rather than focusing on what may be the part that you don't like about it. And I think the attitude with how you approach the countries really makes a big difference, and that's why I start with a joke. We made Nice our home base on the French Riviera. Nice was founded by the Greeks over 2,000 years ago and wasn't a French city until 1860, when it was actually given to the French by the King of Sardinia in recognition, strangely enough, of France's help in the Second War of Italian Independence. So Italy becomes independent, but loses Nice, which was actually at that point more Italian than French, which makes Nice an interesting place to go because it is a French city and has been for over 100 years, but has very much Italian influence in it. And the easiest place to see that is in the food, because for breakfast you can still have your croissant or your pain au chocolat, but for dinner you're probably going to have pasta or pizza, because those are more prevalent than the traditional French dishes. Or you can have, like we had, a ravioli that is a smaller ravioli but served with a French beef-style sauce rather than an Italian-style sauce. So a very interesting place, and the name for the style of cooking that is done in Nice is à la niçoise, or as is prepared in Nice. And of course that mixture between French and Italian can sometimes get a little strange, like a calzone that has almost a raw egg inside, a very slightly cooked egg inside, or a 4-cheese pizza where one of the cheeses is actually brie. Interesting combinations. In Nice we opted to stay in an apartment, and in the apartment slept 6, with 2 in a bedroom, 2 in a loft, and 2 on a pull-out couch. And the cost for the apartment was 450 euros per week, so that breaks down to about 75 euros per person per week, which is pretty good. We didn't stay the whole week, but still it is charged on a weekly basis. We stayed for about 4 nights there. And the apartment was right near the Acropolis, which seems to be a convention center, and then also the Museum of Art, which led to some confusion because as we're calling for directions for the person who ran the apartment, who's a school teacher who's doing this to supplement her income, and I'll put the contact information for this apartment in the show notes. She said parking is right by the giant cube. We didn't know what that meant, but when you see it, you understand, because there is a large statue, I would have to say, or building, I guess it's really a building, by the Art Museum, which is maybe 50 feet across, and it's like someone has taken a mannequin head, but instead of having the head on top is a large cube. And so it's quite striking when you see it, and it made actually a good landmark, which just we didn't understand what she was saying. The apartment was somewhat older than indoor plumbing, so getting a bathroom in there, they had to shoehorn it in a bit, but that just adds to the charm. And the apartment made a great home base. It was about a 20-minute walk from the train station, so we got some exercise every day, but very close to Old Town in Nice, which I'll talk more about later on. And also then provided a kitchen, so the kids actually made us dinner one night in the kitchen, and very close to local businesses, like down the street from the place where you could pick up your croissant or your pain au chocolat for breakfast for €2, because it's more of a residential neighborhood, and so the prices were more reasonable. And close to a laundromat, and it was time at this point to do some laundry. Because we pack very light. We pack with 1 carry-on suitcase per person, even though we're going for 2 weeks, and really just don't believe in packing heavier than that. And the person we rented from is planning on adding air conditioning to that apartment, which would have been nice, as well as a few other smaller apartments over the next year, so you might check out that contact information. Now, one thing about the French Riviera that I should say right away, for those of you who have not been there, the French Riviera is obviously known for where people go to see and be seen and to lie on the beach and such. But I should comment about the beaches. Now, I loved Nice, and much more Nice for me would be the place where I'd say, hey, I could stay here for a while. It'd be great to have an apartment. Of course, we're staying in an apartment, which makes it feel much more like home right away. But the beaches at the French Riviera, the ones that we saw, and we saw the beaches at Nice and Antibes and on Monaco and Cannes, and we'll talk more about them in a bit, are really nothing to write home about. Nice in particular actually doesn't have a sandy beach. They don't even have a pebbly beach. They have a stony beach. It's actually looks like river stones. Check out the links that I'll put in the show notes for pictures, or the pictures in the iTunes enhanced version. But basically it's rocks, and none of the beaches that we saw are also very wide. Between the shore and the ocean is often only 20-50 feet. And then they're packed with people, just packed with people, most of the beaches that we saw. And the water was warm-ish, but certainly I wouldn't say the beaches compare to Hawaii or the Caribbean or Australia or several other places that we've been. They're lovely, but I wouldn't go all the way to the French Riviera if what you're looking for is a great beach. Now, if you're looking for a decent beach and good food and picturesque towns and such, then this is the place to go. As we explored this area, our first stop was the Principality of Monaco. And Monaco, as you're no doubt aware, is a separate country. It's known predominantly for its royal family as well as for its casino. It's not a very big country, and if you're going to go to the casino, I should tell you there is a very strict dress code. Men will need to bring a jacket and tie, and women will need to bring a very nice dress. And since we didn't pack anything like that, we didn't plan on going to the casino, but instead our very first stop was to run up the hill, and it's a rather big hill where the palace is, to be there in time for the changing of the guard, which happens right at noon. And the changing of guard in Monaco sounds something like this. And I'll save the rest of that for a video episode, which will come up here in a couple months as I start the videos for Europe on the second version of the show and the video version of the show. I have 2 more videos from Turkey that I'm going to put up first. Monaco is beautiful, and we were there on a gorgeous day. I can't imagine more beautiful weather than we had. You couldn't have been 1 degree cooler or 1 degree warmer, which is pretty good because a lot of Europe has been having either tremendous heat or tremendous flooding this summer. As you're standing up in the top of the hill that is the palace, you have a beautiful view of the whole principality. And the very first thing that strikes you is that Monaco is not a poor town. Just the size of the yachts alone that are lined up in great numbers gives you an idea of the wealth that is in this principality. We had joined our friends Jim and Marilyn by this point, who he had also met up in Rothenburg, who I mentioned last week. And they were with us while their son Paul was off with Liz and Donna exploring Nice. And we just really enjoyed the twisty little passages with shops up at the top of the Acropolis. We saw the statue of the founder of the Garibaldis, who founded Monaco as an independent nation. The whole old town on this beautiful blue sky day seemed to be bathed in a golden light, and it really was a fairy tale kingdom. You understand why the press had such a field day when Princess Grace, who was a movie star in the United States, Grace Kelly, married into the royal family, and why this seemed like such a fairy tale story to be living in this particular place. And she was buried here in 1982 after she suffered a stroke while driving the highways in Monaco and plunged down the mountainside. And she is buried in St. Nicholas Cathedral here on the top by the palace. And there are still flowers that mark her grave. And then upon his death in 2005, Prince Rainier is also buried next to her. On a less somber note, she is remembered throughout Monaco, and there is, for instance, a series of signs that mark historic occasions that involved her, which is called a parcours there, which caused a little confusion for us because in the States, a parcours is an exercise course where there are a series of exercises like do pull-ups here or do push-ups here or whatever. And so a Princess Grace parcours, we didn't know if that meant, this is the royal wave exercise spot or whatever where you practice that, but we caught on eventually. We grabbed some lunch from a local shop, some quiches and other food, and then picnicked right outside the palace there. After lunch, we walked around a little and gazed at the cruise ship in the harbor and the boats in the marina, the gardens that are back towards the ocean. There's a statue there of a seafarer in his bad weather gear at the wheel of his ship, and it reminded me very much of a statue in Massachusetts that's dedicated to the fishermen who died, for those who did go down to the sea in ships, except I suppose in Monaco it would be dedicated to those who go down to the sea in yachts, but other than that, it's the same basic concept. And then we basically grabbed the train back to Nice. We were traveling to Monaco by train, I don't think I mentioned, because we had read that there really wasn't any point in bringing a car. There's no good place to park in Monaco. And the other thing is this whole region is covered very well by the local trains in terms of getting around, and so that's something we would recommend. So the next day, in fact, we boarded a train in the opposite direction for the very famous city of Cannes, home of the Cannes Film Festival. And this for us is a bit of a pilgrimage because my son is a movie maker. He's a film student in Southern California. And so we certainly hope to come back here sometime and see one of his movies. The ladies particularly enjoyed shopping in Cannes. And this was just the 6 of us because Paul and Jim and Marilyn had gone on with their vacation. And while the ladies were shopping, Kevin and I explored the city of Cannes, some of the facades of the old hotels. We did not take the tourist train, which exists in a lot of these little towns. Looked a little too touristy for us. And then went down to the beach. Now, most of the beach at Cannes, especially the center portion of the beach close to town, are private beaches. Private beaches often associated with a particular hotel, but then you can also rent a chaise lounge at a particular beach, and you can get waiter service there and an umbrella and such. And those run for somewhere between 10 and 14 euros a day for renting a chaise lounge on the beach with an umbrella. not counting whatever meals you would get. And so there are often restaurants right down there next to the private beaches. And then to the far left, to the far right, and then past the right to the next cove, past the marina, there are more larger public beaches. Again, the beaches are sandy here, but they are still very small beaches, and they're still very crowded beaches. Now, we did go into the water at Cannes, and I did enjoy it greatly, so I don't want to dissuade you from it, but I just want to give you realistic expectations. And one thing in terms of realistic expectations is to talk a little bit about bathing suits, about swimwear. You have probably heard that every woman on the French Riviera is going topless, wearing a bikini without the top, and every man is wearing a Speedo. And that is somewhat of an exaggeration. It's certainly a common fashion statement for people of all body types. It is not just the young and the fit who dress that way. But on the other hand, what we saw is some women wearing one-piece suits. They are less common, no matter what your age or body type, and men wearing more of an American-style, longer swim trunks. So I don't think you need to feel uncomfortable from the point of view of what you're going to wear. Now, you still may feel uncomfortable if, like me, you're a married family man going to the beach with your wife and daughter coming from the U.S. Then some of the casual attitude towards toplessness may be a little uncomfortable, but I just took off my glasses and went into the water, and I had bad enough eyesight that I didn't have to worry about being too distracted until, of course, one of the most beautiful women on the beach decided to come into the water and cool off. But what are you going to do at that point? The next day we went to Antibes, which is partway between Nice and Cannes. And Antibes used to be the last city in France when Nice was still part of Savoy or was part of Sardinia. And so Antibes at that time was a fortified city, and across its harbor was a fort, and that fort is still there. And so the first thing we did is we walked over to that fort and explored it, which has wonderful views of Antibes, as well as being an interesting English-speaking tour of the fort itself. It's very well preserved, or it has been very well restored, more accurately. The fort was built after the invention of gunpowder and the cannon became prevalent, and so it's a star-shaped fort. You can always tell because a castle that was built before gunpowder was prevalent will have straight walls, and a fortification that was built afterwards will have angled walls so that the cannonballs will bounce off. And basically there won't be any right angles. There's a soccer or football training area that's right adjacent to the fort that used to be an army base, and there's still a statue that is a memorial to the French soldiers who died in World War I, and it's a statue they call the Hairy Man, which is apparently the nickname for French soldiers in World War I, at least according to what the guide told us. As we exited the fort, we went back around the marina, which is still protected by the fortification walls. They've left the outside sea walls of the original fortifications, but took down the ones in the land, I'm sure, to expand the city. And there's a number of different yachts and such. Again, this is a very well-off area. There is a small beach in Antibes, which is just outside of the city fortifications towards the ocean. And so if you're interested in doing the beach at Antibes, you can do that. And then there is shopping in Antibes and cafes and all the things you would normally find in a French town. But what I really enjoyed about Antibes was exploring this old town, just walking through some of the alleyways and just getting lost trying to find some of the towers. There's two old towers that stick up from Antibes, and finding the ivy-covered buildings that are still there, and finding the hidden churches and the marketplace on the other side of town, and just something that is, even though I didn't have my good camera with me, and for those of you who missed last week's show, you can go back and hear the tragedy of that story, but still just walking around and taking some video and shooting some pictures of this very pretty city, especially once you get away from the commercial areas and into some of the back alleys that are some of the old part of town's residential areas. Just a quick word about French pronunciation, because if you start looking up the places that I've been naming, like Cannes, C-A-N-N-E-S, or Antibes, A-N-T-I-B-E-S, or even Nice, which is spelled like nice, you may get a little confused if you haven't studied French, and my apologies to Miss Shanley, my French teacher from high school, for any damage that I may have done to the French language in this podcast. But one guide for pronunciation is that often the end of a word in French is not pronounced, and there are only 4 consonants that are pronounced when they are at the end of a word in French, and they are the 4 consonants that are in the word careful, C, R, F, and L. And so the S, which is appearing at the end of Antibes, is not pronounced. I hope that helps. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about Nice, which I really thought was a wonderful home base in this particular area. And what I'm going to recommend is doing some of what we did in terms of day trips and save a lot of Nice for the evening. And there's 2 reasons for that. One, we already mentioned the beach is more rocky than pebbly than sandy. And the other reason is Nice is, if you go to the right place, if you go to the old city in Nice, Nice is wonderful at night. Nice really comes alive and has quite a lot of activity going on. If you go to the old city, there are squares just filled with outdoor cafes, and there are people out till certainly past midnight. There are bands that were playing when we were there that were in the parks that the girls went and listened to. There was just a lot going on. Street performers, we watched some breakdancers in front of the Palais de Justice. There was someone who was playing a lute wearing the costume of a medieval musician. And because Nice is a French city, really I should try and say something about fashion, and I find that I'm a real guy here, so I'm not going to express this very well, but there is a wonderful sense of fashion that is not over the top, but a very casual beauty that is the style of dress that we're seeing of people wearing in Nice as well as these other cities here. It's not a beach city where you're wearing your bathing suit around town, so the French woman would be in more often a dress, something loose and flowing, or maybe something with a tank top and a skirt, or very nice shoes and the right handbag and such. But there's something about it that the ladies in our party really noticed that stands out as just I think casual beauty is sort of the best way that I can express it. And there's something very French about that experience as you're walking around town. And my apologies for not being able to express that very well, but I do have this Y chromosome that makes that difficult to comprehend or difficult to express. Now, there are some times that it did cross that line from casual to glamorous or from casual to over the top. We were in Antibes and we saw a woman who was walking her baby carriage, so clearly a mom, but not matronly, if you understand what I'm saying. She had a plunging neckline on a bright red dress, and it was just an interesting contrast in style as she's pushing her little baby here. 2 last closing thoughts on the French Riviera. One is that if you're in the Nice Railway, check out the exhibit of the locations of where the units are for the French Foreign Legion, which still exists. And the second one is, while I'm highly recommending going to this area, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm recommending using Nice as a home base, I should tell you that right now Nice is going through a lot of construction as they're putting in a light rail system, and so it might actually not be a great time to go at this point. You might want to give them a year to finish up their construction, because I mentioned when we first got to Nice we got terribly lost. Well, in part the streets don't go the way they do on the map right now until they finish that construction. But all in all, just a wonderful spot to go, just really thoroughly enjoyed it, and certainly something that I think you'll enjoy. I have 2 internet resources for you today. I haven't tried either one, so I'm interested if you have some experience with them. SkyAuction.com is what that caught my eye. They are offering different auctions. So, for instance, one of them that's at the top of the page right now is bid for a one-way business class ticket from Newark to the Luton Airport in London via Silverjet, and the minimum bid is $600 right now, and so you can bid on that. And if you win for this particular one, you can buy up to 5 tickets for that particular price, but you have to buy at least one if you've bid on it. So check that out, skyauction.com. And another one for looking for low-price airfare in Europe in particular is Skyscanner, skyscanner.net. And I'll put links to both of those in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. Thanks to all of you who voted for the podcast in the recent podcast awards. The voting for that has closed, so I do appreciate your support in that. If you're interested in doing something similar where this time you can win something. There is a contest now at Podcast Pickle, the Reviews for Riches contest, where you can win $100. So if you have a favorite podcast, this podcast or anyone else, and you go to Podcast Pickle, you could see the rules for that. You have to enter a review that is at least 29 words or more. It can't be the same for two different podcasts. For every review you enter, for every podcast you like, you get an entry in the contest. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. If you're interested in supporting this or any podcast and maybe winning $100, then check that out. I had an email from Keith, who listened to the Belgium and Netherlands podcast and said he's been to Bruges, Delft, and Brussels, as well as the other places mentioned, and still has the Heineken Delft beer mug as a souvenir. He says if you want to see the roofs of Bruges, no need to climb up to the cathedral. There's nearly as good a view from the roof of the Straft Hendrik Brewery. I did not know that. Thanks very much for telling us, Keith. I'll put a link to Keith's travel blog, travelrat.wordpress.com, in the show notes. And with that, I think we'll bring this episode to a close so I can get it out. If you have any other comments, send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or look at all the other different ways to contact me, including a new comment line at amateurtraveler.com/contact. And the new comment line is 408-849-4POD. That number again is 408-8494-POD. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.